My name is Margaret, and the night I overheard my husband whisper into his phone was the night my entire world cracked open. He thought he was alone, thought I couldn't hear. But I stood just down the hall frozen as he pressed the phone tight against his ear and said the words that sliced through me like glass. I miss you. Tomorrow you'll move in. For a moment, my heart refused to beat. I had lived with this man for more than 30 years. We had raised a son together, built a life brick by brick, and I had believed foolishly that loyalty still meant something in this house. Yet in that one sentence, I heard it all: the betrayal, the plan, the arrogance. He wasn't just sneaking around with another woman. He was planning to bring her into our home, my home. I didn't even realize my son had been standing behind me until I felt the weight of his presence. He leaned close, his voice steady, sharper than I'd ever heard it before. Don't worry, Mom. He'll regret it. His eyes burned as he glanced toward his father's study. Tonight, he'll know the truth. That was the beginning. But let me go back, because you need to understand how a whisper in the dark can carry decades of history on its back. I grew up in Ohio, the daughter of a steelworker and a school teacher. My parents taught me that marriage was about grit, sacrifice, and standing by your vows. I carried those lessons into adulthood. When I married David, my husband, I thought I had found the man who shared those values. For years, I played the dutiful wife. I cooked, I cleaned, I raised our boy, and I endured. That's the word I use now, endured. David started off kind. I'll give him that. He was charming, ambitious, and people respected him. But ambition has a way of souring into pride, and pride has a way of curdling into cruelty. Over the years, he became more controlling, more dismissive. He handled the finances, locked away papers in his study, and treated me as though I was a guest in my own home. I told myself it was just his way, that he was stressed from work. But deep down, a small voice whispered that I was losing him. Still, I kept the family together. I cooked Sunday dinners. I ironed his shirts. I supported his career events even when he barely acknowledged me. And through it all, my son watched. He saw the way his father ignored me, the way he snapped when I asked simple questions. He saw me swallow my pride again and again. Maybe that's why, in the moment of my deepest humiliation, it wasn't anger that rose in my son, it was determination. That night after I heard the call, I retreated to the kitchen. My hands shook as I gripped the edge of the counter, trying to steady myself. 30 years of sacrifice, and he was going to toss me aside like an old coat. Not just that, he was going to install another woman into the very rooms I had cleaned the walls, I had decorated the table, where I had served countless meals. My son followed me into the kitchen. He wasn't a boy anymore. He was a grown man, taller than his father, now with a quiet strength in his shoulders. He poured me a glass of water and set it down in front of me. Mom, he said, his voice firm, we're not going to let him get away with this. I wanted to argue, to tell him it wasn't his fight, that he shouldn't carry my burdens. But when I met his eyes, I saw something unshakable there. He wasn't just speaking as my son. He was speaking as a man who had grown up watching injustice in his own home and who had finally decided enough was enough. We sat together at that kitchen table, the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. I thought about the years I had given to this marriage, the birthdays, the holidays, the long nights, when I waited up for David to come home. I thought about the countless times I had defended him to friends, to family, even to myself. And now, I was left with nothing but the sound of his voice promising my place to another woman. But I wasn't alone anymore. My son's presence changed everything. For the first time in years, I didn't feel powerless. He pulled out his laptop. We're going to look into this, he said. We're going to find out exactly what he's been doing. And when we're ready, he'll regret every single word he whispered into that phone. His confidence was a lifeline. I nodded, though my chest still ached. This wasn't how I had imagined my later years, facing betrayal staring down the collapse of my marriage. But life has a way of throwing storms when you least expect them. And sometimes storms wash away the lies, leaving only the truth standing. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake in the bed we had once shared, listening to the steady tick of the clock on the dresser. Every tick felt like a countdown to tomorrow, to the moment when David would expect to bring his mistress into the house. I clenched the sheets in my fists and whispered into the darkness, not to him, but to myself. This is my home. He will regret underestimating me. The next day would begin the unraveling of his plans. But it all started with that whisper in the dark, the whisper that shattered everything, and the promise in my son's voice that gave me hope. I didn't cry the next morning. I moved through the house on autopilot, started the coffee maker, fed the dog, opened the curtain so the maple tossed dappled shade across the living room. Habit is a kind of mercy. It gives your hands something to do while your heart catches up. David left before sunrise, briefcase in hand, a clipped goodbye tossed over his shoulder. I watched his taillights fade down our Ohio street and felt something stubborn inside me refuse to break. People imagine a long marriage collapses with one dramatic blow. It's closer to erosion, one small cut at a time. In the early years, we were ordinary Sunday church potlucks, a used minivan we were absurdly proud of. I worked part-time in the elementary school library and took the PTA newsletter because no one else wanted it. David worked late to climb the ladder. He liked being the man who knew what to do. I liked being useful. That's how many of us were raised, to smooth edges, keep the peace, make the hard parts easier for everyone else. Control didn't arrive like a thunderclap. It crept in politely. David started by handling the taxes. I'm better with numbers, he'd say. Then the bills, then the investments. Papers disappeared into his study. He began locking the door when he wasn't home. Client confidentiality, he said. I told myself it was reasonable. I had nothing to hide and nothing to prove. I ironed his shirts, sent thank you notes, made casseroles for grieving neighbors. Our son grew up in that house. He did homework at the kitchen table while I proofread the church bulletin, and David took calls in the den. There were good years, Little League, the diner, on Fridays, Christmas lights that kept shorting out. But laughter ran alongside, something harsher, the way he corrected my stories in front of guests, the money lectures over a $20 purchase, the sigh when I asked a question he didn't want to answer. I learned to skip certain topics. He learned that I would. By the time our boy left for college, the house felt like a stage set, arranged to flatter David's certainty. I dusted trophies I hadn't won and hung photos from galas where my name never appeared. Friends would say, "You're so lucky he provides," and I would nod because gratitude is expected. But luck never felt like this, walking through rooms I'd painted and realizing none of them answered to me. I kept one corner that did the kitchen. It was mine, my recipes, my systems, my notes taped inside a cabinet door. When sleeplessness set in, I stood barefoot on cool tiles at 2 a.m. and made lists, spices, to reorder birthdays, to remember ways to be indispensable. If I couldn't be admired, I could at least be needed. The affair didn't surprise me. The brazenness did. There were late meetings, a different cologne, shirts too modern for a man who disliked change. I sensed a presence without seeing a face. But to hear him murmur, "I miss you. Tomorrow you'll move in," as if inviting someone to a backyard barbecue that stripped the varnish from every compromise I had made. He wasn't just stepping out, he was trying to rewrite the story of our home. After the call, my son and I sat at the same kitchen table where he learned his multiplication tables. He's a man now, my father's shoulders, my mother's eyes. He listened more than he spoke. When he finally talked, it wasn't bluster. It was a plan, careful and methodical. He asked practical questions: whose name was on the deed, which accounts were joint, whether I kept copies of anything. Embarrassment rose. How could I, who managed so much of our life, know so little about the paper holding it together? I walked the perimeter of the life I had built. Laundry room, pantry, the spare room where I stitched quilts for the church raffle, every space told on me. In a file box under the bed, I found a slim packet from the year my mother died, edges brittle with time. I remembered the day the house passed to me at the county office, David's arm a little too tight around my waist for the corridor photo. "We'll take good care of it," he'd told the clerk, speaking as if we were a single person. And that person was him. By afternoon, resolve turned into motion. I called our pastor to say I'd missed choir practice. I texted a friend to cancel our walk. Then I sat with my son and watched him work with quiet competence. He pulled bank statements, flagged unfamiliar charges, 2 delivery schedules, a storage unit lease, across-town deposits that didn't match our patterns. He checked the Smart Lock app and showed me how guest codes could be disabled. He created a folder labeled Home and dropped every screenshot and PDF into it, neat as newly folded laundry. I brewed tea and thought about the women I know, widows, divorcees, those who stayed and those who left. We trade recipes and sympathy, but rarely documents. No one tells you when you're choosing cake flavors to learn the county recorder's hours. We assume institutions will protect us, marriage vows, bank logos, the familiar clerk behind the glass. But institutions are only as strong as the person who reads the fine print. I had not. I would now. That evening, I set the table for 2. Not for romance, those days had gone stale, but because ritual keeps a person upright. We ate in the soft clatter of forks and planned. We weren't plotting revenge so much as restoring balance. If David wanted to test his power, we would test the limits of the truth. He had mistaken my silence for permission. He would learn the difference. Before bed, I stood at the threshold of his study. The door was shut, a quiet sermon about boundaries he enforced for both of us. I didn't touch the knob. I didn't need to. Tomorrow would be for records, not rooms for the paper trail he never expected me to follow and for putting our names back where they belonged. The following morning, I woke with a knot in my stomach, the kind you get before a storm. My son was already at the table with his laptop open, the glow of the screen painting his face in pale light. He looked up and gave me a nod, steady calm. "We start today, Mom," he said. I pulled my robe tighter and sat across from him. He had already logged into our joint bank account. "Do you ever look at these statements?" he asked, gently scrolling through pages of transactions. I shook my head. For years, David had handled it all. That was how we lived. He took care of money and I took care of everything else. It was the arrangement he preferred, but now I saw what that trust had cost me. Line after line appeared on the screen. Furniture stores in Columbus, a storage unit rental across town, repeated deliveries from home improvement shops. None of these were things we had discussed, and certainly none were for me. My son highlighted them, his jaw tightening. "He's been furnishing her move for weeks," he said. I felt sick. Every purchase represented not just betrayal, but arrogance. He wasn't hiding it, not really. He assumed I'd never look. He counted on my silence. My son clicked open another tab. "County Recorder's Office," he explained. "Property deeds are public record. If he's trying to change anything, we'll know." He typed in our address. Within seconds, a PDF popped up. My breath caught. There it was, my maiden name printed clearly, owner Margaret Ann Richards. The house wasn't his to give away. It had been transferred to me years ago after my mother passed as part of her estate. I covered my mouth with trembling hands. He knew I whispered. He knew this was mine. My son nodded grimly. He's been bluffing, acting like the king of a castle he doesn't own. I felt something shift inside me. For decades, I had accepted David's narrative that he was the provider, the authority, the one who made the rules. Yet the truth was written in black and white. This house was mine. All those years, he strutted locking doors and issuing orders. He was standing on ground that legally belonged to me. We dug further. My son pulled up the smart home app. "Look at this," he said, pointing to the guest access logs. A code had been set for the next morning, labeled simply "New Resident." My chest tightened. He hadn't just promised her. He had arranged everything, the locks, the furniture, the deliveries. But that morning, sitting side by side with my son, I felt something stronger than fear. I felt clarity. David had built his entire facade on control and secrecy. Now with a laptop and public records, his empire crumbled like wet paper. By midday, we had a folder full of evidence, bank statements, delivery invoices, property deeds, screenshots from the lock system. My son named it simply Truth. I stared at the word on the screen, the weight of it sinking in. Tonight, David would come home believing he still held all the power. He would think tomorrow was the day his mistress would move in. But tonight, the truth would stand in front of him undeniable. As I made sandwiches for lunch, I remembered my father's words from long ago. He had been a quiet man, but steady. Margaret, he once told me, paper doesn't lie. People do, but paper tells on them. For years, I forgot that lesson, trusting a man's voice over the documents in my drawer. Now I was relearning it through my son. We spent the rest of the day quietly preparing. I folded laundry, tidied the living room, brewed tea, ordinary acts in a house that no longer felt ordinary. My son organized files, printing duplicates in case David tried to dismiss digital screens as tricks. He even slid one copy into a plain envelope and tucked it beneath the salt container on the kitchen counter just in case. That evening, the house glowed softly in the golden hour. I looked around at the photos on the wall, our wedding picture, family vacations, graduations, and wondered how many smiles had been staged, how many memories had been edited in David's favor. Yet for the first time in years, I didn't feel like a bystander in my own home. When night fell, I sat across from my son again. "Mom," he said quietly, "you've carried this family on your back for decades. Tomorrow he planned to erase you, but tonight he learns that the home he claimed was never his to give away." I nodded, my throat tight. The fear was still there, but underneath it lived something new, power. Not the kind David flaunted loud and showy, but the kind that comes from truth. As I lay down in bed, I whispered into the darkness, echoing my son's vow. Tonight he'll know the truth. That night the kitchen smelled of pot roast, the kind of hearty meal I had cooked 1,000 times. I moved through the motions, automatically mashed potatoes, green beans with slivered almonds, a pan of cornbread cooling on the counter. Dinner was a ritual in our house, and even when my heart ached, I couldn't imagine letting David see me falter. I wanted everything to appear as it always had, right up until the moment it didn't. The front door opened at 6:30 sharp. David's voice carried into the house, brisk and self-satisfied, as though the day had gone exactly the way he planned. He set down his briefcase, hung his coat on the rack, and strode into the dining room. "Smells good," he said, dropping into his chair with that air of entitlement I once mistook for confidence. "Busy day tomorrow. We'll need the house ready." I caught my son's eye across the table. He gave a small nod. The moment had come. We ate in silence for several minutes. David didn't notice the tension. He was used to being the only one whose comfort mattered. He ladled potatoes onto his plate and began speaking about weekend plans, about how we'd need to clear the guest room for renovations. He didn't even bother with pretense anymore. The words slid out casually, as if this were his home, alone to command. My fork clinked against my plate. "David," I said, my voice steady, "there's something you should see." He barely looked up. "What's that?" My son rose and walked to the sideboard. He returned with a plain folder and placed it on the table between us. David frowned. "What's this?" "Evidence," my son said calmly. His tone was measured adult, not the voice of a child seeking approval. He pushed the folder closer. "Bank statements, delivery invoices, property records. Proof of what you've been doing. Proof of what you planned for tomorrow." David scoffed, but his hand trembled slightly as he opened the folder. He flipped through the pages, scanning highlighted charges, furniture deliveries, storage units, payments to companies we had never used before. He looked up, trying to sneer. "So you've been spying on me?" "No," my son replied. "We've been reading the truth you left in plain sight. You weren't careful. You thought Mom would never look. You thought she wouldn't understand." He leaned forward. "But I do." I reached across the table and tapped the page he had stopped on. "This house, David. Do you see the name Margaret Ann Richards? My mother left it to me, and I've kept it in my name ever since. You may have locked me out of your study, but you can't lock me out of the county records." My voice grew stronger as I spoke. "You were planning to move another woman into a home that doesn't even belong to you." For a moment, the color drained from his face. He set the papers down slowly, as if they burned. "That's ridiculous," he said hoarsely. "I've paid for everything here. Repairs, the mortgage." "There was no mortgage," I interrupted, calm but firm. "Not since my mother's estate settled it. Every cent you spent was maintenance on property that never belonged to you. You lived here because I allowed it, and you betrayed that trust." David's eyes flicked to our son, searching for support, for some foothold of authority, but he found none. My son's gaze was unwavering. "Tomorrow isn't happening," he said. "The locks have been reset. Deliveries have been canceled. And if you try to bring her here, the police will treat it as trespassing." He pulled out his phone and set it on the table. The lawyer confirmed it. David slammed his fist against the wood, the sound echoing through the room. "You ungrateful little—" "No," my son cut him off, voice sharp as steel. "You're the ungrateful one. Mom gave you 30 years. She gave you loyalty, patience, respect. And you plan to throw it away for someone else. That ends tonight." The silence that followed was heavier than any argument. David's bluster collapsed under the weight of the papers in front of him. He shuffled them as though searching for a loophole, but the ink didn't lie. Every charge, every receipt, every deed, it all pointed to one undeniable truth. His power had been an illusion, and the walls of that illusion were closing in. I stood then, my knees steadier than I expected. "I want you to understand something," I said. "You've treated this home like it was yours to rule mine, to clean ours only in name. But tonight you face the truth. This is my house. You cannot erase me. You cannot replace me. And you will regret underestimating me." David looked between us, his lips parting as though to argue, but no words came. He gathered his briefcase with jerky motions and stalked toward his study. The door slammed shut. For once, I didn't flinch at the sound. My son exhaled slowly, shoulders dropping. "It's done," he murmured. "He knows." I touched his arm, my voice soft but resolute. "Tonight he learned the truth," I said. "And from this night forward, nothing will ever be the same." The next morning dawned gray, the kind of sky that makes everything look like it's under a veil. I stood at the window with my coffee, watching David's car sit idle in the driveway. He hadn't left for work. That alone told me something had shifted. For years he was out the door before sunrise, chasing meetings, appointments, deals. But now he lingered trapped in a house where the walls no longer obeyed him. I heard the shuffle of his footsteps in the hall, heavier than usual, like he carried stones in his pockets. He didn't greet me. He didn't sit at the table. He walked straight past me and yanked open the back door, stepping onto the porch to pace with his phone pressed tight to his ear. His voice was low, but the words carried something's wrong. I need you to hold off. No, don't come here yet. He thought I couldn't hear him. He still underestimated me. My son appeared in the kitchen doorway, already dressed for the day, laptop tucked under his arm. He gave me a look that said, "We stay steady," then set the laptop down and connected with the family lawyer over video call. The lawyer was an old family friend, a man who had known my mother. His voice crackled through the speaker. "Margaret, your name on that deed makes things simple. If David tries to move anyone in, he's liable for trespassing. And if he spent joint funds to do it, that's misappropriation. You've got every right to freeze the account." My heart hammered, but I nodded. "Freeze it," I said. David stormed back inside just in time to hear the lawyer confirm the process. His face went red. "You can't." "I already did." I interrupted. My voice was calm, steady. For years, I had bitten my tongue to avoid confrontation. Now every word I spoke was a nail closing the coffin of his authority. He slammed his hand down on the counter. "This is my house," he shouted. I stepped closer, close enough for him to see the steadiness in my eyes. "No, David. This is my house. It always has been." The fight drained out of him, replaced by something uglier, desperation. He retreated to his study, slamming the door so hard a frame rattled off the wall. My son picked it up and set it straight again. "Every time he raises his voice, he loses more ground," he said quietly. The day dragged on with David locked away in that room. I cooked lunch. I folded laundry. I spoke with the lawyer again, finalizing documents to ensure no unauthorized guest codes could be issued to the smart lock. My son changed passwords, secured accounts, even called the storage unit company to request a freeze on the account, citing suspicious activity. Step by step, brick by brick, David's fortress of control collapsed. By mid-afternoon, the phone call started. First, a contractor confused about canceled deliveries. Then the moving company asking whether the scheduled appointment was still valid. Each time, my son answered politely, clearly explaining that any orders tied to David were void. And each time I saw David's expression tighten from behind his closed door. His empire was unraveling faster than he could patch it. The crack that mattered most came just after 5. His mistress called. I didn't hear her voice, but I saw his face when he answered. Red, then pale, then a twisted mix of rage and shame. He barked words into the phone. "It's not my fault. She's interfering. It was supposed to be tomorrow." He slammed the phone down so hard I half expected it to shatter. I leaned against the counter, arms folded. For years, his fury had frightened me, but now it looked pathetic, like a child denied a toy. Dinner was quiet. He barely touched his food. My son and I spoke softly about ordinary things, the dog, the weather, the neighbor's new car, as if David were a ghost at the table. His silence was the loudest thing in the room. When he finally spoke, it was with a trace of the old arrogance. "You think you've won, but people will believe me before they believe you. They always have." I met his gaze, unflinching. "Not this time. Paper doesn't lie." I slid the folder of documents back onto the table, a silent reminder. He didn't touch it. He couldn't. Later that night, I stood in the living room, lights dim, staring at the family portraits on the wall. In so many of them, David stood front and center, chin lifted, the rest of us orbiting around him like props. But as I looked closer, I noticed something I had never seen before. My son's eyes, even as a boy, were always fixed on me, not on him. He had seen the truth long before I admitted it to myself. Upstairs, the house creaked with David's restless pacing. Downstairs, I felt the cracks widening. For 30 years, he had built his identity on control of money control, of image control of me. But control is fragile. One whisper, one truth, and it all splinters. As I turned off the lights and climbed the stairs, I whispered to myself, "Let it crack. Let it fall. The truth will stand when nothing else does." By Saturday morning, the neighborhood was already awake. Lawnmowers hummed down the street, kids pedaled their bikes in circles, and the smell of bacon drifted from open kitchen windows. It was the kind of small-town Ohio weekend that usually passed without incident. But that morning, something shifted. Word travels fast in communities like ours, faster than you'd think. And when a moving truck pulled into our driveway just after 9 people noticed. I was pouring coffee when I heard the rumble of the engine. My son glanced out the window first. "She's here," he said flatly. I joined him at the curtain. A big white truck with bold red letters sat idling. 2 men in uniforms jumped out, clipboards in hand. Behind them, a sleek black sedan rolled to a stop. The passenger door opened and a woman stepped out. Blonde hair, too much jewelry for the daylight heels that sank into our gravel drive. She smoothed her dress and scanned the house with an expression that said she already belonged. My chest tightened, but I stayed where I was. Fear wanted me to hide. But I had lived too long in David's shadow. Today wasn't about hiding. Today was about truth. David appeared a moment later, rushing down the stairs, shirt untucked, hair wild from a night without sleep. He practically tripped over himself to reach the front door. "Don't say a word," he barked, as if still clinging to authority. He yanked the door open and stepped onto the porch, his voice syrupy. "Now, darling, you made it." The neighbors began to gather. The Petersons paused mid-gardening across the street. Old Mr. Jenkins leaned on his cane by the mailbox. Curtains twitched up and down the block. Small towns thrive on spectacle, and David had just handed them one. The movers hauled open the truck, revealing furniture wrapped in plastic boxes labeled closet, kitchen, bedroom. I saw the woman's face brighten, her steps quicken as she moved toward the porch. She didn't hesitate. She thought this was already hers. That's when my son stepped out, tall and calm, a man, ready for battle, not with fists, but with facts. He blocked the porch stairs, arms folded. "There won't be any move-in today," he said loud enough for the whole street to hear. The woman stopped, confused. "Excuse me, David, what is this?" David blustered, waving his arms. "Ignore him. He doesn't know what he's talking about." But my son didn't flinch. He pulled a folded paper from his jacket pocket and held it up like a shield. "This is the deed. The house is in my mother's name. Always has been. You can't move in because he doesn't own it to give." He turned to the movers. "This delivery is unauthorized. If you unload so much as a box, you're trespassing." The movers looked at each other uneasy. They were just hired hands. One of them stepped closer. "We'll need confirmation from the account holder." "That would be me," I said, finally stepping onto the porch. My voice shook at first, but steadied as I went on. "This is my home. These deliveries are canceled. If you want confirmation, check your system. Payment's been reversed." The younger mover pulled out his phone, tapped a screen, and frowned. "She's right. Payment didn't clear. Contract shows canceled." The mistress's face went pale, then flushed red. "David, what's going on? You told me." "Don't listen to them," David shouted. His voice cracked, desperation leaking through. "It's all under control." But nothing was under control. Neighbors had gathered in clusters, now whispering. Someone pulled out a phone to record. The humiliation spread faster than fire in dry grass. The woman's heels clicked angrily against the driveway as she turned on him. "You promised me. You said tomorrow I'd have a place here." David tried to hush her, but she wasn't interested. "You liar," she spat loud enough for every ear on the street. "You told me this was yours." I stood taller. 30 years of silence boiled down to this moment. I didn't need to yell. The truth did the shouting for me. I said simply it was never his. The movers packed up without another word. They slid the truck door shut, muttering apologies, and drove off. The black sedan screeched away. Seconds later, the mistress glaring daggers through the tinted glass. David remained on the porch alone, his face blotched red with shame. He turned toward me, jaw working, but no sound came out. For the first time in decades, he had no script, no command, no power. Just a house full of truth he couldn't erase. Neighbors slowly drifted back to their lawns and porches, but the damage was done. In a town like ours, whispers are permanent. By sunset, everyone would know. David, the man who bragged about control, had been caught trying to move his mistress into a home that wasn't even his. And it was his wife and son who stopped him. Inside, my son closed the door quietly, sealing off the echoes of the street. He looked at me and smiled faintly. "He thought he'd humiliate you," he said. Instead, he humiliated himself. I poured us both fresh coffee. My hands no longer trembled. For years, I had carried shame in silence. But that morning, shame shifted shoulders. It belonged to him now, not me. As I sat down, I felt the weight of 30 years lift, if only slightly. This was just one battle. There were more to come: legal fights, explanations, choices about the future. But for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel powerless. I felt seen. I felt strong. And most of all, I felt certain that his cracks were spreading wider every hour. Monday morning, the county courthouse smelled like old paper and lemon cleaner, the kind of scent that clings to hallways where people come to swear things are true. I wore my church dress, the navy one, with the simple pearls, and carried the plain manila folder my son had labeled Truth. He walked beside me with that steady stride I had come to trust, and for the first time in years, I felt like I wasn't walking into something alone. We checked in at the clerk's window. The woman behind the glass looked over my petition and emergency request to protect my property rights and freeze the misuse of joint funds, then stamped the top page with a firm, satisfying thump. Department 3, she said, pointing down a long corridor. You'll be called. David arrived 10 minutes later, jaw set, tie pulled too tight. He didn't look at me. He kept his eyes on his phone as if a screen could shield him from what was coming. When the bailiff opened the door and called our case, the sound rang through me like a bell. The courtroom was small pew benches, a state flag, drooping slightly, a calendar the judge seemed to ignore. People sat scattered, 2 young men in work boots, a woman with a stroller, a couple holding hands too tightly. I wondered for a breath what brought each of them here. We all carry our private storms into public rooms. Case number. The clerk began, then finished with our names. Petitioner Margaret Richards, respondent David Richards. I stood. My son put a hand at the small of my back, a quiet anchor, and I stepped forward. David rose a beat later as if he'd missed his cue. The judge looked over her glasses, late 50s, silver hair swept back a face that had seen 1,000 versions of the same story. Mrs. Richards, she said, voice even. You're asking for a temporary order preventing any third party from taking up residence in your home and placing injunctive limits on joint account withdrawals. You're also asserting that the property is your separate inheritance. Is that correct? Yes, Your Honor. She nodded. Show me. I opened the folder and slid forward the first exhibit, the deed. My maiden name on the line that mattered. The judge read in silence, then initialed a small note in the margin. I offered bank statements next. The highlighted charges to moving companies, furniture stores, the storage unit. These are from the last 60 days, I said. I did not authorize any of them. Understood, she said, turning pages with a soft rustle. And these smart lock records. Guest codes created for the day after I overheard a phone call. I answered, steady now. He told another woman, tomorrow you'll move in. The judge's pen paused. Across the room, David shifted, then flashed a thin smile. Your Honor, with respect, my wife is dramatizing a domestic matter. I provide for this household. We have always made decisions. Mr. Richards, the judge said, without looking up, I'll hear from you in a moment. For now, don't characterize. Respond to the documents. His smile faltered. There's context, he tried. Those purchases were necessary home improvements. Labeled closet and bedroom, my son said quietly from the second row, and the judge lifted a palm enough. Mr. Richards, she said again, do you dispute that the deed is in your wife's name? He flushed. No, but I've paid for it. Separate property can be maintained by a spouse without changing ownership, the judge replied. Tone still mild. And joint funds used for a purpose adverse to the marital estate raise their own questions. She set down her pen. Do you dispute the creation of guest access codes to the residence? No, he muttered, but it was premature. Something in me untied at that word, premature, as if it had only been a timing issue, as if tomorrow would have fixed the indecency of it. The judge watched his face a long second and then turned back to me. You're not asking me to decide a divorce today, she said. You're asking me to keep the status quo, who lives where, who spends what, until this can be sorted. Yes, Your Honor. She leaned back. Status quo is the law's favorite place to wait. I don't remember breathing while she signed. The clerk slid a fresh order across the bench, temporary restraining provisions prohibiting any non-family occupancy without my written consent. An immediate freeze on discretionary withdrawals from our joint accounts. Notice to the storage unit to hold items pending review, and a direction that any deliveries to our address require my express authorization. The language wasn't dramatic. It didn't need to be. It was clean. It was enough. David stared at the paper as if it were written in a dialect he never learned. This is absurd, he said louder now. You can't embarrass me like this. The judge's gaze sharpened. Mr. Richards' embarrassment is not a legal standard. Actions have consequences. You may seat yourself." The gavel tapped once. People who had been pretending not to watch stopped pretending. I heard the faint shift of bodies on benches, the rustle that runs through a room when one story lands and everyone recognizes a piece of their own. Outside on the courthouse steps, sun flared off the parked cars. The air smelled of diesel and hot asphalt. My son stood with his hands in his pockets, the corners of his mouth set. "It's on paper now," he said. "He can't rewrite it." David came out behind us, pulling at his tie. He looked smaller in daylight. A young couple passed and glanced at him with a sympathy that wasn't for him. From the sidewalk, our neighbor, Mrs. Talbot, called my name, then stopped when she saw his face and just lifted a hand uncertain. News moves quick on days like this. It doesn't need gossip, just eyes. David took 2 steps toward me, then stopped, when my son moved the easy kind of movement that says, "Not today." For a beat, no one spoke. The wind flipped the corner of the court order in my hand. I pressed it flat and slipped it into my purse like a letter I'd been waiting to receive since the day I said I do. He tried for one last bluff. "You'll regret this," he said, almost pleading. I met his eyes. "No," I answered. "I regret what I tolerated. The rest is just truth catching up." We walked to the car. My knees felt oddly light, as if air had gotten into the joints. At the curb, my son opened the door for me the way his grandfather used to open it for my grandmother, a small, old-fashioned courtesy that felt like respect made visible. I sat, folded my hands, and let the quiet settle. On the drive home, the town looked the same, flags on porches, a kid with a lemonade stand, Mr. Jenkins, napping on his swing, but I wasn't the same. The house waiting at the end of our street had always been mine, but today it felt like it had learned my name again. And tonight, when David turned his key in a lock that no longer answered to him, the truth would be waiting in the hallway, framed and hanging where he could not avoid it. This is what public feels like, I thought. Not a crowd jeering, not a humiliation for its own sake. Public is a clerk's stamp, a judge's signature, a door opening and closing under the rules that protect ordinary people who do their best and expect decency in return. Public is the air in your lungs when you step out of a room and know the next breath belongs to you. "Almost home," my son said, glancing at me. "Yes," I said, and for the first time in a long time the word meant what it should. The night after court, the house sat quieter than I'd ever heard it. No television blaring from the den, no phone calls rattling through closed doors. Just the hum of the refrigerator and the steady breathing of a home finally allowed to rest. I sat in my chair by the window, hands folded in my lap, watching the street lamps blink on one by one. David moved like a ghost upstairs, pacing, then pausing, then pacing again. He had no meetings left to rush to, no contractors left to call, no mistress waiting in the wings with boxes and promises. The world that fed his ego had collapsed, and all that was left was silence. My son came down with 2 mugs of tea, setting one gently in front of me. He didn't say much, he didn't have to. His presence was the kind of reassurance words can't quite hold. He'd grown into a man his father could never break, steady and unyielding. And somehow that gave me strength too. Around 9, David finally came down. His tie was gone, his shirt wrinkled, his eyes bloodshot from a day of denial. He stood at the bottom of the stairs, staring at me as though waiting for permission to speak. For 30 years I had given him that permission, not anymore. He cleared his throat. "Margaret, this isn't how it was supposed to go." I raised my chin. "No, David. This is exactly how it was supposed to go once the truth came out." He gripped the banister, knuckles white. "You'll regret this. You'll regret making me look weak." I leaned forward, my voice steady, quiet enough that he had to lean closer to hear. "No, David. You will regret what you did. You'll regret betraying the woman who stood by you, humiliating the family you claimed to lead, and underestimating the son who saw through you from the start. You will regret it every time a neighbor looks away, every time a colleague whispers, every time you turn the key in a lock that no longer answers to you." His jaw worked, but nothing came out. He wanted to rage, to thunder, to command, but the words had lost their power. Paper had spoken, truth had spoken, and now silence was louder than anything he could say. I stood, placing my teacup neatly on the table. My knees no longer trembled when I faced him. "Tonight you know the truth," I said, echoing the promise my son had made. "And for the rest of your life you will regret it." David slumped into a chair, head in his hands. That was the man the world once thought untouchable, reduced not by fists, not by fury, but by the very arrogance he carried like armor. The cracks had spread too wide. The mask had slipped too far. and regret had finally found him. My son placed a hand on my shoulder. "It's over," he murmured. I nodded. "Yes," I said softly, "it's over." But it didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a beginning. Later, when I climbed into bed, I whispered into the darkness, not with fear, but with certainty I survived. And I am free. And if you're listening to me now, if you've ever felt small, dismissed, or betrayed, know this: the truth will always have its day. It may take years, it may take decades, but it will come. And when it does, those who doubted you will regret it. So share this story. Hold it close if you need courage. Pass it on if you know someone else carrying their own quiet battle. And if my voice has kept you company tonight, don't leave without leaving me yours. Subscribe, share. Let others know they are not alone. Because revenge isn't always loud. Sometimes it's as quiet as a signature on a deed, as steady as a son's voice in the dark, as certain as a woman finally reclaiming her name. And sometimes the sweetest revenge is knowing the one who tried to break you will spend the rest of his life remembering the night he learned the truth.